All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to do my best actually just to get on with this, and I might refer to my other computer so I can actually see the screen. It's kind of small in my window. So I'm presenting on assessing social equity in farmer-managed natural regeneration interventions, findings from Ghana. I realize this is a slight change from the title, but this is the title that we've since used to submit the paper. I'm presenting on behalf of my co-authors here as well. This is a paper that we've submitted to the journal Ecological Restoration, which is part of a special issue that's been organized by some CGIAR people, and on restoration by whom, for whom. So to get right into it, first of all, what is farmer-managed natural regeneration, FMNR? So FMNR supports the regeneration and management of indigenous trees and shrubs, and it really started as a restoration approach, as a packaged restoration approach during the Sahelian drought of the 1980s, with some work being done by NGOs, some community-based actors, extension services, particularly in Niger. And the aim is to increase the presence of woody vegetation on farmland, woodland, and pasture. And it's really acquired increasing traction as a means to restoring degraded and deforested areas in African drylands. But the point that's really important to make is that FMNR, to speak more generally about supporting the regrowth of indigenous trees and shrubs, is nothing new. Farmers, different land users have been managing trees within landscapes for generations. And that's something really important to note. So why FMNR? Well, a lot of this has to do with what's seen as its particular suitability to drylands. And that's because of the chronic challenges to tree planting interventions, or specifically rates of tree survival in dryland environments. And there is an emerging evidence base that shows that FMNR is really linked to improvements in a whole host of things, from carbon sequestration to biodiversity, a lot of very technical things. So for us, the study justification, and I should say, hence why I mentioned initially that this paper is going towards a more technical crowd. I know the social element, I think this audience is well aware, but we really emphasize it, is that while the technical evidence base for FMNR is strong, we really lack understanding of the social processes that could lead to inequitable outcomes in FMNR. And achieving social equity is very important. And of course, it's also part of some major global and regional level restoration efforts. Also, as far as the UN decade on ecosystem restoration goes, 2021 to 2030. And of course, understanding the social processes that can lead to inequitable outcomes is especially important as a lot more financing goes into FMNR. It's implemented in a number of countries across Africa through different types of projects and programs. And I think while perhaps a lot of the audience and panelists here know about this, I emphasize it here, is that the access to and control over trees, like land, is very socially differentiated. And this really influences how and which and where trees are selectively managed within the landscape. It has a lot to do with who wins and who loses as a very important natural resource. And then also, for those who don't do a lot of work on tree tenure, it's something that's often different from land tenure. That's a really important thing to keep in mind. So our general aim, as we frame it in the paper, not sort of as much a research question as it is something to sort of be provocative, is which trees are regenerated where and for whom. And we very much are trying to communicate how our study offers insights that are useful more widely for assessing social equity in other FMNR interventions in African drylands. We use McDermott, Mahanti, and Schreckenberg's social equity framework, and Kate Schreckenberg from King's College London is also a co-author on the paper. And there's really three main components to their social equity framework: the distributive dimension, which has to do with how benefits, costs, and risks are distributed; the procedural, which is a lot about decision-making issues around there; the recognition, which is often a separate component to social equity frameworks. In this case, is subsumed under the procedural dimension. And then contextual, which is part of why we really liked using this particular framework for analyzing our analysis in the paper, because it's really about recognizing that uneven playing field that has to do with these pre-existing political, economic, and social conditions. And so this framework, which really emphasizes social context, was something that we really communicate, in particular in the paper, and then also when I presented this to more biophysical and technical crowds where they don't often think about the social context. Okay, and that, as I have in bold here, is because tree and land tenure, political economy, and dominant environmental narratives were some of the key ways that things that emerged from our data as really important for assessing social equity in FM&R. So we did this work in Salience district in Upper East region. We actually were going to add another case in Kitui County in Kenya. We completed scoping, but then with COVID, we had to call off field work. Briefly, in Upper East, it's part of the Guinea Savannah Agroecological Zone. It's a semi-arid area. It's monomodal rainfall. Something worth really highlighting is that it falls within what's often referred to as the parklands, or the West African parkland system, which is very generally is an agroforestry system, and it's defined by the integration of scattered trees on both permanently cultivated village fields and long-term fallows. And Upper East is characterized by a mix of sedentary farmers, NTFP production, also mobile and sedentarized pastoralists who are by and large Fulani. We speak more about it in the paper, not a lot of time to go into it here. I can do so in the Q&A, however, but very generally rural land and trees largely falling under customary tenure in Upper East region. So brief background to the intervention. It's in Salience. It's been implemented by an international NGO, World Vision, since 2009. They've worked in almost every community in Salience. It has a very integrated approach. So there's sustainable land management activities paired with alternative livelihoods, diversification paired with more forest landscape restoration. Along with the implementation of FM&R, or I should say, one of the important components is creating these community FM&R sites, which range quite a bit in terms of size. And the site's very important within respect to how they've implemented it in Ghana, which is not necessarily the same in terms of how FM&R has been implemented in other countries in Africa. But the site's meant to serve as a demonstration ground and to promote farmer-to-farmer extension. So part of larger regreening. You have a creation of a community group. I can explain more about that if there's interest in terms of how that works. Really important is how land is allocated. It's based on this agreement, but it has to be done in consent with the usufructuary, which is it's still lineage land, but it's that household, typically involving that senior male who actually has extra land, typically marginal, already degraded, who agrees to give land. And there might be multiple usufruct landholders who are allocating land for these community sites, which then become governed as the commons. And there are bylaws that are then created and supported by the chieftaincy, for instance, other local leaders around making this area commons. Okay, and so for instance, community members may harvest natural resources from the site, such as firewood from the branches that they prune through FM&R through this pruning technique. But they are prohibited from cutting down wet trees and using fire to manage the landscape. And I actually just realized, I don't know if I have something on the slide, but the basic approach to FM&R is keeping the most vigorous stems that are sprouting from live stumps in the ground or seedlings to try to promote them to the growth of these shrubs, and especially in the trees, to become taller and to basically increase their presence in the landscape. Apologies if I missed that. These are just some quick images of one of the community sites. You can actually see with one of the images some of the degradation. That's actually small-scale surface mining pits known as Galamsey in Ghana on one of the sites. On the other one, you can see some of the small shrubs as well as some more mature shea trees in the background. We have a more expansive table in the paper, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there were basically 3 types of variants we were trying to capture as far as community selecting study sites, selecting communities. One was date of FMNR implementation. The other was proximity to the major urban center, which in this case is Bolgatanga or Bolga, and then livelihood base. Also, we have actually expanded table on this in the paper. For our purposes here, I'll just say this was a multi-phased study. We used participatory and qualitative approaches. I was the one who did the data analysis. I did so using in vivo 12, using both deductive and open coding approaches. I can explain more about that. And really important for our study is that as a qualitative iterative study, the concurrent data analysis allowed for refinement of sampling as well as selection of different data collection tools, depending on what was kind of emerging from previous phases. So to move into some key findings here. First, we found that an equitable distribution of benefits, costs, and risks from the community FMNR was particularly likely to come out of the multiple layers of land and tree tenure arrangements nested within the sites. Okay, and so for instance, 4 research participants from one of our study communities indicate in interviews and informal conversations that the land allocating household maintains certain usufruct rights to the land. So for instance, they still have the rights, really the primary rights to harvesting the commercially valuable nut of shade tree. And this contradicted the governance, the commons governance model promoted by the FMNR project. 2 of these participants also noted improvements in soil fertility as an anticipated or experienced outcome of community FMNR. And we highlighted this because there's a good evidence base in the literature, especially on woodlots, in terms of scenarios that can develop where the land allocating household or households or those most proximal to the site and or really get most of the benefit in the future, particularly if the lands are reclaimed. And then this would mean an inequitable outcome because you basically have people from the community who are improving the land, but then they're bearing that cost because only a select few would actually benefit. Secondly, this has to do with the procedural dimension and particularly how social inequity can crop up with site selection and how site selection can reinforce pre-existing inequalities in land tenure within communities. And what we found was that the community FMNR sites in our study communities, which were 4 actually in total, were allocated either by a household from the first comer lineage in the area, and I think during Q&A I can provide some context if there's lack of understanding between first comer, that sort of terminology, or from a household within a lineage that, since it was also one of the earliest settling lineages, so there might be, for instance, 30 lineages within a community, had a special relationship to the first comer lineage. And this really illustrates the differentiation in terms of along first comer and late comer, that axis, which is really important for understanding land tenure within certainly northeastern Ghana, but then elsewhere, of course, in Africa. One of our community FMNR sites in Goriko, in this case, was located in a latecomer site, but in our interview with the chief, it was indicated that it was first comer lineages which allocated the land there. And so the question that we think is worth raising, and we see our study, given that they're really only a very small sample, it's certainly a hypothesis generating, or at least saying, hey, we need to have more research on this to expand the sample, perhaps to something where we can generalize is, okay, how much influence do latecomer lineages have when it comes to determining where these community FMNR sites should be located in the community? And this is very much a procedural equity issue. Third, we found similar issues around distribution on farm and tying into land and tree tenure arrangements as we did in the community FMNR site. So for instance, we learned from our youth-only focus groups that younger women and men in particular rely on bush farming in the savanna woodlands in Upper East because they lack access thanks, Tom, to cultivable land in the villages. And it's important to note cultivating bush farms is a common for those physically capable, and cultivation rights are acquired either through one's household or through acquiring secondary rights from another use structure household. But the exact nature of those farm level resource agreements between tenant farmers and those usufructuaries, first of all, they differ a lot, very case by case, but they often entail very clear tree tenure restrictions. So, for instance, a tenant farmer might not be able to harvest tree products from, for instance, the shade tree. Okay, and given that young tenant farmers, or rather younger people are more likely tenant farmers, we think it's worth pointing out younger people will be less likely to benefit in this case from FMNR. And then there's a study with Benham et al. Who working elsewhere, working more further up in the Sahel, they found the adoption of FMNR is generally greater for households with larger land holdings. And it's worth pointing out, we think that, okay, given the importance of patriarchy as well as seniority and customary tenure systems, it could be then that FMNR is really going to benefit older men more likely, as opposed to, say, women or younger people or other marginalized groups who will more likely have less access to smaller plots of land. Fourth, wild tree and land tenure were really key social contextual factors influencing decision-making in the intervention. I'm sure it comes no surprise to this crowd, but political economy was also significant. And the point that I address here in this presentation is that we found pastoralists in Ghana, who are mainly Fulani, were generally excluded from participating in the intervention at Talanzi. And it's really important to recognize that farmers like pastoralists like farmers manage trees, within the landscape, albeit with a different purpose. Okay, so there are different demands there. The historical context to Fulani is also very important. In Ghana, there's a history of exclusion, marginalization. Another key point, like other so-called settlers, they acquire land as secondary rights holders, normally only depending on an allodial trustee, normally a chief. And we do point out in the paper, and certainly want to do so here, the marginalization of Fulani in Ghana is well beyond the scope of an FMNR intervention to address, but it's really worth noting because still their exclusion has clear social equity implications, but then also it raises practical concerns around land management and land use planning, particularly when FMNR is used for greening pastures. And then finally, and this is a really kind of political ecology point, is the importance of how political economy intersects with this other dynamic, which is the salience of dominant environmental narratives. Okay, and so we want to point out that this exclusion of certain land user groups, in this case Fulani, is linked perhaps to these higher level discursive dynamics. And so within drylands, we know there's a lot of these global environmental narratives, things like desertification, degradation, desiccation, and this can basically reinforce political economies that marginalize the knowledge and practices of local land user groups. And we take the example of how FMNR in Ghana categorically discourages the use of fire as a land management approach. But this simplistic focus on fire suppression really doesn't understand or recognize the spatially and temporally heterogeneous local fire regimes in West Africa, as well as fire's cultural significance, because certainly in the Upper East region, fire is really important, plays an important role in the origin stories of lineages oftentimes. And perpetuating narratives of bush burning, as it's so called, in which all anthropogenic fire causes land degradation, this can result in and reinforce, thanks Tom, misinformed colonial era policies. As a really good paper, Laris and Wardell, which actually addressed this in the case of Ghana. And the Fulani are often blamed. And so we want to point out how that marginalization of Fulani ties into this global environmental narrative, so as a discursive dynamic with political economy in this context of restoration. So just to conclude here, I won't go over those top parts. I think that comes out pretty clear. I mean, just briefly, tree and land tenure, political economy, and dominant environmental narratives were these key social contextual factors that had to do with equity. So we really wanted to underscore, especially given the audience, we think of a lot of the readership who might be for this work, points of social context, but then also how social context is really often underappreciated in the design, implementation, and evaluation of restoration interventions. And that's something that really needs to be addressed, and it just often isn't. And then finally, reiterating, as there's more financing within the forest landscape restoration space and with FMNR, we really think that some of these points around social equity really should be taken into consideration, and we're trying to communicate that. All right, that will be all. Thank you. Going to stop this now.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Okay. Is that okay, Johanna?
Okay. Yeah, fine.
Great. I will hand over to you then. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Hello to everybody. I will be talking today about resource use in indigenous communities and territories in southern Chile, and how the mechanism of mining concession is impacting the access to these territories, and specifically to the subsoil in these areas. This research is part of my research project financed by the Chilean Agency for Investigation and Development. And I started research in April last year. So this is actually not a paper I am presenting, but rather first findings of what we have done last year. So if someone could forward to the next slide. Thank you. The theoretical framework is based on a combination actually of environmental governance and political ecology. I use that framework mainly because I think that this perspective allows an analysis of environmental struggles at multiple levels and geographical scales. And this allows to understand environmental conflicts as a part of the transformations of nature and territory, which tend to foster existing inequities between global and local forces, which is actually what we observe in the indigenous territories in southern Chile. Thus, it also aims at understanding and identifying the range of players involved in these resource conflicts, and to understand, obviously, the power relations between nature and society. So could you please forward to the next slide? Thank you. My research is mainly focusing on hydropower development in these areas, which generate local socio-environmental conflicts between those who benefit and those who are deprived of the access to water, specifically as a resource. And they also evidence the different hydrosocial relations and knowledge rationalities in these territories. One example for these knowledge rationality clashes is, for example, how water is understood as a commodity by some players, and on the other hand, the indigenous people use it as a basic means for the living, and they describe the water flows, for example, as the veins of life, and they are intervened irreversibly through the dams or run-of-a-river projects. Please forward to the next slide. Thank you. Well, I am geographically focusing on Chile, and this has first to do with that I am based here in Chile, and secondly with the fact that during the second government of Michelle Bachelet, which started in 2014 and ended in 2018, the Ministry of Energy fomented the expansion of small hydroelectric power plants as one of the key actions of public policy, as a part of the decarburation plan in Chile, and, well, obviously to contribute to diminishing the CO2 emissions. So they concretely wanted to construct around 100 small hydropower plants, and a very high number of them is localized in indigenous territories in southern Chile. My case study, which I will discuss later on, are all located in indigenous territories in the south of Chile. And because, as I already mentioned, this is like an area where you can observe the different connections to water and space linked to construction processes of ethnic identities. And in these discourses actually overlap three key elements: land, livelihood, and identity. This leads to the fact that struggles for resources in indigenous territories are often linked to demands for more power and autonomy regarding resource use, which in Chile they have nearly no autonomy about what is happening with resources in their territories. The only element that is actually more protected is actually land. So historical conflicts linked to the dispossession of land in the past are usually also part of the struggles regarding other resource use and control in these territories, and specifically also linked to hydropower development. Could you please forward to the next slide? Thank you. So let me just shortly explain or briefly sketch some key points of the Chilean regulations regarding resources and land, because there are some main characteristics that are relevant for this research and what I will explain later on. So first of all, the regulations are highly fragmented and individualized. Water and land rights are separated from each other. So both are property rights, but you can own water rights in a territory that belongs to someone else. And this is also not limited to indigenous territories. So if in an indigenous territory, you can own a water right, not being indigenous and not living in this territory. On the other hand, the subsoil belongs to the Chilean state, and you can request mining concessions in case there has been a mineral identified in this area. And what I already mentioned is that land has been protected since 1993 with a new law. So it can no longer be alienated, seized, or encumbered except between communities and indigenous persons of the same ethnic group, but there can be made exceptions. So the National Corporation for Indigenous Development can authorize a line between private and non-indigenous persons and indigenous persons. So this is what happens when hydropower projects enter indigenous territories, that they actually swap land. This has happened, for example, in a huge dam constructed in southern Chile in 2004, where they've swapped a lot of indigenous land that should be equal, but evidence shows that it's not, to actually realize the project. So in the following, I will briefly discuss our first findings. We are using a qualitative approach with observations, participation, actually, well, recognizing the territory, and also semi-structured interviews to local and regional, but also national decision makers. Concretely, I'm talking about what we have found out regarding 2 case studies. These results aim actually, this is kind of one of the research questions, to exemplify the consequences of the key characteristics of the Chilean regulation of resource and land use, such as the fragmentation of rules and rights to access and control land and resources, and how these further strengthen the position of globally active economic actors while weakening that of local actors. So please forward to the next slide. Thank you. So the first case I will be talking about is the Iraqi Hydroelectric project, which is located in Curarreva. That is a small rural town in southern Chile in the Andes. and where we find more than 70% of indigenous population. So this is a really high number. And this is kind of a virgin territory, so there has not been a lot of development so far. The Iraqi project is a run-of-a-river project linked to a Chilean family involved in multiple businesses and economic sectors. And the project seems to be really small because it only aims at generating 9 megawatts. But as we have learned in a paper from Sarah Kelly, megawatts do not mask impacts. So this does not necessarily mean that environmental and social impacts, for example, will be lower than with a bigger project. So if you please continue to the next slide. Thank you. So what happened here actually? Previously to the development of the project, the project owners counted with the water rights. They already had them, but the plant pipeline and the machine house and the restitution of the water to the river were located in the project on indigenous land. So what they had to do was to swap indigenous land to another property. So what they did was to enter the territory beforehand, and they negotiated with the people living in this area. And they finally reached an agreement with one of the owners of this indigenous land, and they actually were able to swap it. In this whole negotiation process that they did on a private basis and very informally, they also got to some agreements with economics and other compensation with other members of the community, which were actually linked to the person that agreed to the land swap. So they prepared everything before entering the project to the official process of environmental impact assessment. So could you please forward to the next slide? Thank you. So this had really profound consequences for the indigenous community, because there were people in the community which really opposed to the hydroelectric development. So they actually expelled, or the members that were in favor of the project and that actually agreed to the land swap and that had these agreements with the company, they were expelled from the community. So actually social tissue was ruptured as these members of the community were banned. At the same time, we can observe that these incidents lead to strategic changes among the opponents of the project. So they actually start to reivindicate their ontologies and their cultural understandings. And instead of continue to argue in the winker, what they call the Western concepts, they start to recover their culture, integrating new generations and using these other concepts. And this finally leads to the fact that although the project is finally approved by the Chilean states and by the environmental regulations, that these opponents take the approval to court, because this whole process leads to a persecution also in NGOs and advocacy groups, and they support these opponents to take these to take their opposition to the court. And well, this means that the whole project will be taking more time and that it means more costs. So actually taking a project to court the project owners do want to avoid this. So according to our field work in Curarewe, which we did last year into field trips, has led to changes in the strategies of hydroelectric companies aiming at developing the projects in these territories. So if we go to the next slide, then we can discuss another case study, which is Ririn Lil, which is located in the same area, because it's also close to Curarewe. And it's an even smaller project than Iraqi. They only aim at 3.7 megawatt. And but here we can see that actually megawatts do not mask impacts, because the project implementation sees that there should be a 30-meter barrier, and that the planned investment is of $9 million US. But still, to date, there are a lot of inconsistencies in the project, so it has not been qualified in the environmental impact assessment process. It has been entered twice, but it couldn't be qualified in one of the cases because there was not enough information, and the other in the other case they actually redraw the project owner. But the municipality of Curarewe, they informed us that there's a new modified version of the project prepared, and that in this context they are actually requesting the mining concessions to avoid legal problems with the indigenous people living in the territory. So if you could please forward to the next slide. The mining sector, on the other hand, has a completely other perspective why these mining concessions are requested. According to them, hydroelectric power companies are requesting mining concessions to avoid that other actors request them to paralyze their projects, which has happened in the past. Because juridically, the mining concessions impose themselves over other rights. So if I have a mining concession in a territory where there's on the top, on the other land, going on something else like energy transmission lines or energy projects, well, the mining concession is mandatory. So I need to be able to exploit my mineral. So that's a reason why the hydroelectric power companies are actually requesting the mining concessions, to protect that anybody else will come and impede the development of their projects. This leads, on the other hand, from the mining companies' perspective, to the problem that minerals are not exploited. And they want to avoid these actions of the hydroelectric companies, as this is generating negative externalities for them. Could you please forward to the next slide? Thank you. So actually, and here is where we can see an information gap also between national and local state authorities, and also the economic interests, because these conflicts have led to changes in regulation aiming at protecting the mining sector and favoring the energy generation companies, and thus global and national interests. So in February 2016, a new law was enacted that impacted positively all the development of non-conventional renewable energy projects. So this law aims at unlocking the development of projects of the energy sector by avoiding that mining concessions are requested and obtained by individuals to impede the development of energy projects, and thus discouraging the owners of non-mining projects from taking over mining concessions of large territories. So this means that actually also the energy development is protected when there is something going on in the subsoil. So if someone has a mining concession and is not actually exploiting the mineral, this new law does not impede the development of energy projects on top. And this also benefits, obviously, the mining industry, as this discourages the owners of non-mining projects from taking over mining concessions of large territories to protect their projects, and thus a large area of territory is available for mining concessions to be taken over by owners who use them for mining. So these preliminary results show that there is an information gap, which I already mentioned, between different levels of the state, as it seems that the municipality does not count on the information regarding the new law and its consequences for the relation between subsoil and superficial rights in the case of hydropower development. This, from our point of view, underlines that the power imbalances existing between local and national players within the state, but also between global players and local communities, are encouraged through the new law. And the new law points at protecting the interests of hydropower and mining development in Chile and not of the indigenous peoples. So please forward to the next slide. Thank you. So our preliminary conclusions could be or are that Chile is characterized by regulations and policies that promote both the energy and the mining sector, and that these actually protect the interests of hydroelectric companies when developed in indigenous territories. And at the same time, these regulations are highly fragmented and often generate incompatibility between territorially integrated resources. We're talking about water, land, mining, energy resources. So regarding the research questions and the theoretical framework that underlies our work, we conclude that policies and regulations enhance the power imbalances between multinational companies and local and especially indigenous communities, but also within the state at different geographical scales. Both cases, in our view, exemplify the consequences of this fragmentation and the existing property rights in Chile for Mapuche communities or indigenous communities, the indigenous people we are looking at Mapuche, at a local level. The Iraqi case additionally shows clearly how hydropower development and the associated strategies to take over land and resources rupture community social fabric. Also, not only generating these global local power imbalances, but also internal power imbalances between the communities and at a local level. And at the same time, promote the rediscovery and reconstruction of cultural understandings and ontologies used in the defense of their territories. But we need to do more research, specifically the consequences of the Lille hydropower project at a local scale need to be deepened and complemented through further research. With more fieldwork post-corona, we hope to be able to go back to that in September, October of this year. So thank you very much, and I'm very glad to hear your comments and questions. Thank you.
Perfect. All right, great. I will remove myself, and it's all yours.
Thanks, Matt. So hello, everybody. So today I'll present the preliminary empirical findings of my PhD research to date. So I'm now in the third year of my PhD at SOAS in economics, and currently writing up. So as you can see, my research deals with poverty, labor, and land dynamics of artisanal and small-scale mining in northwest Tanzania. And in particular, I'm looking at Geita region, which is located in northwest Tanzania. Yeah, so my supervisor is Matteo Rizzo. Yeah, and let's, could you please forward to the next slide? Or can I do that by myself? Okay, so a quick remark before we start. In the following, I'll use the terms artisanal and small scale interchangeably. So in the literature on Tanzania and in a broader way on Sub-Saharan Africa, artisanal mining usually refers to the use of rudimentary tools and is often understood as being illegal, hence non-licensed. So on the other hand, small-scale mining usually is characterized by a minimum degree of mechanization and by operating under a legal license. And both are rather labor intense and capital scarce. And for Tanzania, the large majority of operations are non-licensed, hence would fall under the category of artisanal mining. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So let's delve into the structure of this brief presentation. So I'll begin with a quick motivation, then a rough literature review, my resulting research questions and design, and then the main part of this presentation, my fieldwork findings and conclusions I made so far. And I think that's it. So feel free to get back in the Q&A if anything is unclear. So, could you forward to the next slide, please? So what motivates this research is first the economic importance of artisanal and small-scale mining for rural households in Tanzania, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa. So to understand this relative importance, I plotted the largest artisanal and small-scale mining populations in Sub-Saharan Africa against the number of people directly working in the sector. So that's the light gray bar, as well as against the number of dependents from the sector, which is the dark gray bar. And as you can see, the largest populations are in Ghana, but also in Ethiopia. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that particularly Tanzania has or is considered to have one of the largest populations of dependents from the sector, argued to be around 9 million people. And if you know that Tanzania has around 57 million inhabitants, this is quite a large fraction of its population. And but however, nevertheless, these numbers should be taken with a grain of salt. First, because these are informal activities, so it is difficult to really capture the true number of people involved and indirectly involved in the sector. And the second question always, when you talk about statistics, I think, who reports these numbers? And so, and often in the case of Tanzania, this is done by minor unions, and so who might have an interest in reporting higher numbers to have a stronger political leverage and political say. Nevertheless, I think this motivates and exemplifies the strong importance of artisanal small-scale mining in Tanzania and more generally in Sub-Saharan Africa. So looking at the next slide, and a second aspect which makes, I would argue, this research important is the political topicality in the country. So in general, we know from the past that rural households aim to diversify their incomes to be more robust against shocks, as for instance, low harvest and droughts in this sense. And within this puzzle of income diversification, so arguing to which income activities are households diversified to, artisanal small-scale mining is sometimes considered to be the most important rural non-farming income activity. And there's a recent flagship report by the World Bank, for instance, which argues in favor of this. And so the question comes up, what is the employment dimension behind the sector and how strong is it? And in turn, this translates, as I would argue, in a high level of political topicality in Tanzania itself, because in the past, public opinion was that large-scale mining operations, mainly driven by foreign direct investment, they're exporting the country's resource wealth and leaving little to Tanzanians. And since 2017, President John Pombe Magufuli, you could argue, follows a different political economy approach, political approach. So he cracked down on foreign mining companies. So the case of Acacia Mining might ring bells to you. And he put legalization under the way, which benefits artisanal and small-scale miners, at least on paper. And so what remains unknown is if ASM incomes are actually helpful to lift people out of poverty and to understand the role of its labor market more thoroughly. Could you forward to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is a brief visualization of my literature I'm looking at. So I'm arguing there's a lack of understanding of rural labor markets in Sub-Saharan Africa. Often these are characterized by a large degree of informality. However, this labor force data is rather unreliable, as argued by Carlos Oya. And for instance, others, as Ben Miller in 2015, argues that ill-designed labor force surveys are not able to grasp the true structure and nature of rural labor markets correctly. And Rizzo adds to this that this is also due to methodological fallacies, so leading to a systematic underreporting of waged labor. And you could argue that it's quite important to understand the prevalence and nature of employment types in the informal sector to design well-suited policy mechanisms. I'm saying this because you could imagine that a waged worker might demand the enforcement of labor and safety regulations, as well as higher and more predictable wages. And on the other end of the continuum, a self-employed worker or miner, in this sense, would require better access to finance markets and technical and training schemes. So you could argue that at the intersection of these three scholarships, so the micro effects of natural resources on households, the literature of the type of employment in the informal economy and on rural labor markets, is where my research gap is located, so the gray dot, and where I try to contribute. So this brings me to the next slide. Thank you. And which is a brief research sketch of my undertaking. So on the left, I plotted rural households with their assets and incomes, and you could argue they provide capital and labor to the sectoral, artisanal, and small-scale labor market, and in return, the labor market provides these households with incomes. And however, it's unclear how these two are interlinked. So how does this labor market really effectively reduce, or does it even reduce poverty? There's mixed empirical evidence on the household level for Sub-Saharan Africa. And what is the role of labor market transmission mechanisms in this? And also what is the role of land? So this in turn, going to the next slide, and one slide further actually, brought me to the following main research question, which asks to what extent and how has artisanal and small-scale gold mining, so looking at one mineral in specific, reduced poverty of rural households in Tanzania, and what is the role of rural labor markets and prevailing employment types in this? So you can see that land is not explicitly mentioned here, but it's clear that if you look at the operational research questions, it needs inevitably scrutiny. So the operational research question would then ask, how does the labor regime, and by this I mean a set of institutional arrangements that has been systematically developed by a specific social alliance and based on a specific social ideology, I would argue, and a specific political economic approach. And so how does this labor regime shape the impact of mining activities on rural livelihoods and poverty reduction? And so this brought me to three basic questions of classical political economy, which are: who owns what, to understand the social relations behind it; so who does what, to analyze the organization of labor processes and how social divisions of labor emerge; and lastly, who gets what, to understand the social divisions caused by the income distribution. And coming to the next slide, I tried to, well, you could say to shed light on these questions by a mixed method empirical framework. So the idea was first to think about a comparative case study design to have the most disaggregated look possible, so at the household level. And given, as I was emphasizing before, given the lack of reliable household and labor force data on the interplay of employment in artisanal small-scale mining and poverty, I decided to gather primary data. So, however, so first I was running in spring last year, 2019, I was running a household survey with around 160 households. But however, because I thought, okay, these numbers are rather of descriptive nature, different empirical methods are needed. So after conducting the survey, I revisited the areas in autumn last year to pursue qualitative interviews with miners, but also with experts, sectoral experts. Yeah, so the idea here was, as you can read, to integrate the economic but also political factors to understand the outcomes for local populations, yeah, in terms of poverty reduction or not, and access to land also. Okay, so having said this, on the next slide, and also the subsequent slide, the main part of my presentation, you could argue, follows. So first, I want to present the results of my household survey. So on the left, you see a map of Tanzania, and you can see in the northwest of the country, so right next to the Great Lakes, there is a Geita district where the majority of gold explorations in the country are located. And on the in Geita district, I looked at 2 mining communities which were surveyed by DFID in 2004 by a group of local researchers. And so I thought it might be interesting to have a comparative element from 2004 and to my 2019 data. And yeah, so I chose, so the report I was referring to is by Rosemary Popo and others. So I revisited 2 case study sites they had visited. The first one is called Nyarugusu ward. You can see it on the right-hand side. You see an aerial map, and you see the red dots. Yeah, these are, thanks Matt for the 5 minutes. And you see the household surveyed by myself, and the yellow dots is secondary data of mining and processing operators. So coming to the next slide, you can see first results, preliminary results. So I looked at the development of different measures of poverty, and in general, you could argue, which is my first main finding, they remained pretty much unchanged over time. So you see on the top the entire sample in 2004, and then you see in comparative terms Ngusu and Nyarugusu, the 2 villages I visited, and you see poverty remains unchanged. So this lends support to the argument of artisanal small-scale mining as a poverty trap. And if you want to, we can talk about these so-called objective poverty measures, which are subject to a large variety of criticism, I think fair, but they just are, and the idea was to provide a rough overview over the development over time. And also there might be a level of self-selection and attrition in the sample over time. Coming to the next slide, my second finding was that there's a strong degree of waged labor in informal mining in both case study sites. So, and both employment categories are not mutually exclusive. So hence a household might be constituted by a waged miner, but also by a self-employed miner. It might even be the case that one and the same person is pursuing both activities on the very same day. You could say that this is consistent with empirical findings by Carlos Oya and others. It contradicts existing labor statistics, the existing narrative that there are low levels of waged informal employment in developing economies. So I think that has some empirical strength. And the second part, now on the next slide of my research, if you go to the next slide, thank you, was to look to analyze the 39 qualitative interviews I conducted, and that's where I'm currently at. So if you go to the next slide, you will see interview excerpts. So first on the interplay of employment and poverty. So one household responded, when you work on your own, you get more money. I think 80% of the people are working at someone else's pit, so they get wage employed. And this is mainly because of low production at their own pits. So they switch. It's a very fluid understanding of employment. They switch back and forth. And another respondent adds, you cannot dig at an unproductive pit. So you get employed even though it's not socially desirable because you need the quick money to feed your family, basically. And on the next slide, you see then more like an in-depth analysis of the appearance and existence of land conflicts on the one hand side of artisanal and small-scale miners versus large-scale mining companies, as for instance in the first quote, the Geita gold mine, and but also of rural households against the government. So this is something I'm currently looking into, and so the first quote, for instance, the respondent describes how how the villagers in Mungusu, which is right next to Geita gold mine, were relocated at first, or wanted, were demanded to be relocated, but in the end, after a long land dispute, the government decided to give the area to a miner association. Yeah, and well, coming to my conclusions, I think the last two slides. First, there's an unchanged high degree of poverty at both sites. This substantiates, I would argue, the argument of USM as a poverty trap, and it contradicts micro-level literature, which aims to establish a positive relationship. However, this is context-specific research, and now the question comes up, to which degree is extrapolation possible? And another aspect, the last bullet point, there's high levels of waged labor, and as emphasized before, and next slide, on the last slide, there's a few open questions, in particularly third question, so the role of land and mining titles and the role of the government in the issuance is, I think, of vital importance. In the interviews, we saw that there's a a certain degree of nepotism. So the people, the very few that do hold a primary mining license, they often have ties to the central government in Dodoma or in Dar es Salaam. Okay, I'm running out of time, so thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
There we go.
Hi, sorry, I'm looking at another screen, so I'm looking off center. Yeah, well, my first question was really, I had a couple of questions to Matt. The first one was that I didn't really quite grasp the salient features of the political economy or even the dominant environmental discourse that, or narrative that had a real bearing on the equity outcomes in the case he described. And my follow-up, my other question was really that it also wasn't very clear to me, although the landowning lineages clearly benefit, they retain the usufructuary rights to trees. So from these kinds of interventions, they're likely to benefit more. And but I wasn't clear how non-landowning family members lost out and what the equity consequences were, and whether or not Matt thought that any sort of land tenure or land governance intervention, whether the context was amenable to any sort of intervention of that kind to actually improve the equity outcomes. Thanks.
Okay, great. Many thanks. And we have one other hand up.
Hi, Joy Clancy, University of Twente in the Netherlands. This is a question for Julian. I enjoyed the presentation very much, but I have some questions about your household surveys. And that's not clear to me. Did you only interview households that are involved in mining? And so does mining have an impact relative to other households? And did you disaggregate the sorts of households? Because women-headed households are often poorer. And one way that they become women-headed households is because men die. And what is you talk positively about the employment, but also what is the attrition rate for miners involved in this sort of mining? And did you only interview men when you interviewed in the households? Because you might have got a very different answer about the poverty issues if you interviewed the women in the household.
I'm not seeing any. So, well, for now, I guess I would add a question for Matt, which is, you mentioned that this was a World Vision project, and obviously the GCRF is very keen on impact. I was wondering to what extent you've been able to engage with World Vision around the findings and the sort of, the potential to think in more complex ways about the sort of social context within which these programs are being implemented, and what they think in terms of the policy implications that might lead to. Oh, and have we got one more question? We do. Great. We have one more question from Isaac. I will bring you up now, and then we can go back to our panelists. Isaac, welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity. I wasn't here from the beginning of the presentation, so I missed probably a large part of it. But I think I am intrigued by his key finding, which is the fact that ASM is...
Which speaker, sorry?
Can you hear me?
Which speaker is the question? For the last speaker?
The last speaker on artisanal and small-scale mining in Tanzania. So I think his key finding is that one of his key findings is that artisanal and small-scale mining is a poverty trap. I think a lot of literature has also come to the same conclusion, which I find a bit problematic, because I think artisanal and small-scale mining comes in different forms, and that is what some scholars don't pay attention to. So in Tanzania, for example, artisanal and small-scale mining is hard rock. And similarly to Ghana, hard rock, artisanal and small-scale mining tend to be poverty trap. But then it becomes a different case altogether when you look at another form of artisanal and small-scale mining, which is alluvial artisanal and small-scale mining. So in Ghana, for example, and Guyana, for example, alluvial artisanal and small-scale mining tend not to be a poverty trap, but actually people make huge sums of money from alluvial artisanal and small-scale mining. So that was just a clarification that I thought was needed, because I am doing my research in artisanal and small-scale mining as well. So I thought maybe that would be interesting to throw in.
Should we go in paper order? and begin with you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So first, yeah, thanks a lot for the question, Julian. I think, yeah, this is really a good question. I think you might be onto something. Certainly, I mean, it might be the framing is wrong. I mean, I was just as I was typing out some ideas, trying to think about that. Perhaps the political economy framing is wrong, or we don't address this right. And I was just thinking about that political economy, how it does impact FM&R, aside from the equity component. I mean, just thinking about that, for one, it's a sort of the interesting thing because it's really about promoting agroforestry, and so it's about leveraging what is a traditional agroforestry kind of agroforestry practice. So it's not a carbon forestry sort of initiative. It's not RED Plus. It's not you know, a sort of some large scale land acquisition or something to promote for, you know, monocrop plantations. I think as far as just actually impacting in terms of as the intervention, kind of maybe putting equity aside, is the general ag policy. I mean, it's very much in Ghana still supporting around, you know, your sort of general modernization type stuff. I mean, the chemical fertilizer, mechanical traction, improved seed, stuff like that. The promotion of plowing specifically and not using the traditional handheld hoe does really matter a lot for whether FM&R can actually practically support regreening, because it tends to limit the number of trees people will keep on plot. Also, policies that are supporting introduction of exotics, especially commercially valuable trees for planting. So there were in Upper East, there's a bank funded project, and there's linked to some payment for ecosystem services scheme involving African rosewood, cashew, guava. So some of these exotics, and what that tends to do is it introduces a more individualization of tenure on farm. I think it also perhaps devalues the relevance of indigenous trees for some. Now, this might be the equity thing. What we are seeing is a increased cutting of shea for charcoal, for instance, or maybe it's also a management thing. It's not being protected enough, and that will then disproportionately impact women who are much more reliant on that particular value chain, which of course for shea is a major one. I was also thinking about the export of timber, which is especially to the Chinese market around African rosewood, and there's a lot of deforestation around that, including in some of the riparian areas where with colleagues we thought, okay, FM&R could be paired perhaps with enrichment planting. That might be a good area, but you have this ongoing deforestation, which has the government, I think, through some sort of rent-seeking, other sorts of mechanisms, really benefits from that big export market. I was thinking back to, and I think you were at that panel where Carolyn Dieterle, I might mispronounce it correctly, was really talking about the land and natural resource policy. And I just, again, reflecting on the political economy, on the policy side, it's very much a case of land rights in practice, rather rights in law that are really most salient with FM&R. You know, it's really what we want to stress, or what we found is, and this, again, it might be a framing issue, is that it's these pre-existing, very locally grounded resource access and use rights, and also that authoritative dimension of kind of thinking of the Secor et al. Framework from that 2017 paper, which I think is really important. And I mean, thinking now about the second part around landholding lineages, how they clearly benefit. What about others? I'm just trying to think of the younger people component. I think the task we had is, okay, let's actually look at this and see, you know, are there groups that are just maybe not able to benefit as much? But it's, aside from more obvious cases of elite capture, so going back to for instance, with the introduction of, say, cashew trees or other commercial tree crops, which then always tend to go to larger landholders, and then that's controlled by males, that impacts indirectly how indigenous trees are managed in the landscape, which is supposed to be the focus of FM&R. So I'm not sure if any of that's making sense, but that's, I think, kind of how we're seeing things. I'd really be interested to hear your comments on what I just said. Maybe I'm off the ball, but please let me know. I know I'm taking up a lot of time, so I'll go to Tom's question. It's a great question, and yeah, certainly with the GCRF, we started out with a very stakeholder engaged and actually a more participatory action research kind of approach, which we wanted to incorporate a lot of co-design elements and ideally co-production. It's a long story there for a variety of reasons, funding, logistical. We've had meetings, stakeholder meetings. We had individual kind of meetings with the implementation office up in Tongo, which is the capital area of Talanzi district. We really weren't able to do much collaboration at the end. I mean, there is a paper that I'm with a colleague and with someone from World Vision. We're co-authoring for the European Tropical Forest Research News Series 60. The abstract's been accepted, and hopefully that does end up coming to publication. And so we are working on co-authoring, but with someone from World Vision. But as far as really trying to think, okay, how can we, bring some of these findings, assuming they are actually salient, into influencing programming, and it's something that we really, we needs to be worked on. And I mean, I certainly can't say in any way we've generated impact, and we haven't even gotten to pathway, impact pathway, I think, yet. So, but something that's really definitely needed.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. Johanna, I don't think there was a question specifically addressed to you, but I don't know whether you want to sort of chip in on any related issues.
No, if there aren't any questions, then I just hand over the word to Julian so he can answer the questions received.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Johanna. So on the first question on the survey, what I did was I tried to include non-mining as well as mining households in the sample. So it's not a purposive sample. So I did this mainly because I wanted to understand and to map out all livelihood activities in these mining areas, let's say. So regarding your second point, I think the muting female miners is very important, or is something very important you brought up, and I did my best not to do this. So in the qualitative interviewing, I tried to capture as many female miners, especially because they belong to the most vulnerable groups, or like to the lowest socioeconomic strata, as we know from earlier research. So I think I found a good mix, to depict very different realities in terms of gender and socioeconomic backgrounds. I think, and regarding the survey, so what we did was we surveyed within, we looked at the household, obviously, and then we looked at each household member and asked for his or her specific waged or non-waged activities in the last 12 months. So Okay, second question on hard rock versus alluvial. So you are totally right. I should be more specific on this. So in this case, it's mainly hard rock, I think there's mixed evidence on this, how this kind and type of mining and the type or non-degree of mechanization translates into improved livelihoods. So it's a good point. I'll keep it in mind. Thank you, Isaac.
Okay, great. So I think we've got about 15 minutes, if I'm calculating that correctly. So there is space for another round of questions if people have it. Also, the panelists, feel free to ask questions of your fellow presenters. Yeah, ready for a break? Then we will move to that. I guess I'll just say that, well, thank you all three of you for your presentations and for everyone for their questions. And then the second session of this panel comes at 4:15, I believe, after the plenary session. So I hope to see many of you there for that also. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
And after that, we have made the 3 major shifts on the land law in Brazil. One was in 1964. The next one was in 2001. And now we have some law shifts that it's going on the Congress now in Brazil, but I don't think we will have time to talk about that. Matt, you could pass by. So how is the state actions distribute in the land titles in Brazil? So after 1999 and between 1999 and 2004, we will have 28,000 projects related to the World Bank land projects. That is pretty much individual land titles from small acres in Brazil. That in Brazil we will be between 1 to 110 acres, and the state indigenous land that we recognize between 1999 to 2019, we have 436 indigenous land and more than 100 in process, but now everything is shuttled down to both with Bolsonaro government. And between 1999 to 2019, we have 134 Afro-descent community title lands and more than 3,000 Afro-descent community lands that it's not recognized or even titled. Matt, can you pass by? So if we can check on this map, the green ones are lands that it's related to state programs reform and World Bank reform. So we can see that it's in the south and in the west and the east coast of Brazil. The yellow ones are land title settlements that it's not related with land struggles or World Bank titles, and the most part of that is in Amazon, if we can check on the state of Pará. And as a current situation, we can see that the agrarian land reform is suffering the biggest retraction on the history of Brazil. And it's quite interesting because even with the private lands, we are having some shifts as well. So the state is not conceiving any more land titles, but land concessions with indeterminate time. So it's kind of a less recognition of the land use of small agriculture people and peasants as well. That it's pretty much the identities in Brazil that use this kind of land title. And for the traditional territories and the traditional lands, everything it's now a bit of frozen at the moment. We have the FUNAI, that is the Indigenous institution in Brazil that was closed, and also the Fundação Palmares, that it's related to the Afro-descent land titles. It's pretty much controlled by Bolsonaro government at this moment. So none of Afro-descent and indigenous land are titling at the moment. And so the approach that the government are doing now is to use concession contracts. So we have more than 14,000 concessional contracts issued from January to September in the past year here in Brazil. Matt, can you pass by, please? And this is quite interesting because we also can see how some land shifts are also related to how the social movements are struggling for some sort of policies in Brazil. So it's, if we can see on this graph that is below the photograph, we can see that in the 90s, we have a decrease of the land conflicts in Brazil and the rise in the gray numbers related to the organizations and marches and occupations of public lands from the social movements, especially the MST, that is the workless, landless movement. In the 2000s, we can see that with the entrance of the Workers' Party in the presidential government, we see that some sort of organizations also decrease the activities of occupying public lands and march and go to the streets to reformulate some land laws. And it's one of the promises of the Workers' Party was to do the third national plan of the land reform in Brazil, that it was closed on his first year of government. And even with this political strategy, the social movements didn't change the way that they approach to the land laws in the federal way. So it's also interesting how in this moment the social movements are trying to be a little more soft with the land struggles in the federal scale, but they start to thinking how to do different approaches on regional and local scales. So, for example, in the end of the 90s and especially in the 2000s, we will see how traditional identities, for example, we have Babasu, coconut woman breakers, we have fisher communities, and for example, communities that work with Açaí, Guaraná, and some, for example, trying to fight for municipal laws, for example. So we have some successful fights on this field, especially on the north of Brazil, with these social movements and these identities that I already quote. And after 2011, 2012, with the change of the federal government in Brazil, we see another rise of the land conflicts happening again. And now with Bolsonaro, it's also something that we can discuss, because we have this major rise of the land conflicts, especially on the north and the northeast of Brazil. And okay. And even so, the land fight as a traditional way that was seen in the 90s keep going down on the gray numbers. So in the first approach to the numbers, to the graph, we could probably think that the social movements are not as active as they were in the 90s. But something that also, as a researchers, we should think it's how we are doing our statistics and our approaches to how the social movements in the land, about land and traditional communities are struggling. So, For example, here in Brazil, we have some social data related to social movements, especially in urban zones. So when we will systemize, yes, the numbers to think about how rural movements are organizing their land, we have to think about different sort of statistics and approaches to do this sort of statistics as well. So I think one of the problems of how the numbers are continuing decreasing on 2090 is because of that, and also because they are kind of organizing in a different way. So we have we did a research last year to how traditional communities see the environmental council and all this sort of state and NGOs and society spaces to fight for policy, for example. And almost none of the communities that we visit, they knew about these councils. And when they knew that the council exists, they don't trust on this sort of council. So how these communities can approach policies inside the state if they cannot be related to these sort of spaces. Matt, can you pass the slide, please? And to think about these approaches, we could talk a little bit about, for example, the traditional fisher communities in Tocantins, that is in north of Brazil, that is struggling with some energy company that is a state and private company. And these communities occupy this land part that is really close to the river. And in the Brazilian law, this is federal law. But they plant, and their traditional way of living, it's really related to this part of the land. And the way that they plant, it's also related to these zones that it's half of the year full of water, and the other half of the year they plant yucca and another kind of stuff. So how we can think different approaches to these cases, and how the law could also understand different sort of land uses. We could see also, for example, the Afro-descent communities in Tocantins, that over that we have different cases, because one of the communities, they had the title of the land that it was recognized in a colonial time, but when they sort of modernized the land law in Brazil on the 60s, they just disappear with the laws and the titles that the community have to do a state colonial project to plant commodities on this territory. And yeah, pretty much that's it. Thank you very much for your time, and we can talk a little bit later if someone wishes so.
All right, thanks very much for that, Deborah. And sorry about having to. I think we cut you a little short with that. The time always creeps up on you. I think what we'll do is just go right ahead, and we'll bring up Tom's presentation. You should be live. Oh, there it is. Okay. You want to take this from here in terms of doing the slides? Cool.
Yep. Okay.
All right. All yours.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah. So this presentation is it's part of a book project that I'm currently working on, and certainly when I put in the paper abstract, it seemed like it would be easier then it is proven to sort of carve out a relatively standalone presentation from it. I think in practice I found it quite hard to sort of separate out lots of different complex processes involved in this, which, yeah, so I'm not entirely sure whether I'll be able to do justice to everything that I'm trying to say, or indeed the complex reality that actually exists. And basically the rationale behind this is to look at Ethiopia, a country which has sort of been widely praised for developmental successes, both in agriculture and more broadly structural transformation of the economy, rapid economic development. But as you know, the literature has rarely considered Ethiopia from the point of view of the agrarian question, and particularly using that as a lens into sort of more of the distributional aspects of its development strategy. And also to start sort of to question some of the common narrative around land in Ethiopia, where, I mean, there's often quite implicitly, but there's an assumption that land tenure has been basically static for, ever since the 1975 nationalization of land, and basically unchanging since then, when I think the reality is that there have been some quite important changes over time of the role of both within land tenure, but also the role that land plays within the overarching development strategy of the government. So in terms of the agrarian questions, it basically picks up on Terence Byers' long-standing view of sort of that there are three main ways in which the agrarian question has been used. So one, looking at the social relations of production within agriculture, and particularly the emergence of capitalist relations of production. The second one, looking more agriculture in relation to industrial accumulation, and to what extent agriculture can support a surplus, how that surplus gets extracted, and whether that can be used to finance industrialization. And then the final one, the political dimension of this, so how political forces and rural class struggle go forward and shape processes of agrarian change over time. And essentially, my view is that the EPRDF government, which was in power since 1991, it's now party's changed its name, which I won't really go into here, but I'm happy to discuss more in the last year. But the argument is essentially that throughout 28 years of the EPRDF rule, the party was centrally concerned with those different aspects of the agrarian question, not necessarily explicitly in that terminology, but with those key aspects of the agrarian question. And that the role of land tenure within a development strategy has been a sort of a key tension that they've wrestled with over an extended period of time. So the starting point kind of necessarily goes back to 1975, when the previous government, the Derg regime, which is a military Marxist regime, carried out the first nationalization of land. The top picture there is Mengistu Haile Mariam, what emerged to be the leader of the Derg regime, sitting with Fidel Castro. So the Derg conducted this land reform. At the same time, the TPLF, which would go on to form the EPRDF, the government that came to power in 1991, conducted its own nationalizations in liberated parts of Tigray during what they described as the feudal elite, redistributing holding rights to any particular plot of land, but you're giving out right to a share of community land. And to do that, then land policy basically banned sales, quite severely restricted rentals, and instituted regular land redistributions to take account of demographic changes over time. And so in terms of those agrarian questions I mentioned before, I mean, there's sort of the basic answers that the Derg and to some extent the TPLF came up with were that, one, you would have a land reform which created a homogenous class of peasant farmers, as Desalegn Ramato has argued. For the Derg in particular, they modeled this very much on sort of Soviet Chinese style surplus extraction by the state to finance industrialization, trying to use the agricultural marketing board that they established, and compulsory sales to the marketing board, agricultural collectivization, which they tried and had modest success with later on. But there's basically a model of state And then in terms of politics, it was more, it was in both cases self-styled vanguard parties attempting to mobilize what they saw as the key class groupings within society. So for the Derg, it particularly focused on the working class, and for the TPLF, very much so the peasantry, based on sort of a Maoist mobilization strategy. Now, the sort of first shift was then when the EPRDF actually took national power in 1991. They kind of came with that baggage of very sort of detailed Marxist-Leninist debates around the agrarian question, around land, but then trying to find a national development strategy that fit with the sort of prior and new challenges that they face. So on the one hand, you had a sort of their concern with raising the condition of the peasant majority, limiting class differentiation, trying to promote self-reliance. But also as a national government, what they described as the overriding challenge they were facing was population growth, where they view that unless you created large numbers of urban jobs very quickly, you would quickly have a situation where the rural land would be unable to absorb rapid population growth, and you would have mass migration to the cities, which they viewed as being very problematic. So you actually had this sort of marrying of Marxist-Leninism along with some distinctly non-Marxist influences, who are these three pictures along the right-hand side there. So Irma Edelman, who originally came up with this Adley concept, economics professor from Berkeley, Michael Lipton and his work on the inverse relationship, and then John Mellor, who was formerly the head of IFPRI and then USAID. And that sort of, those ideas were then congealed into this agricultural development-led industrialization strategy based on the idea where you raise the productivity of all smallholder farmers, try and promote backward and forward production linkages between agriculture and nascent industry, and trying to create a sort of essentially a large internal market for industrial production by raising the productivity of smallholder farmers. Now, in terms of approach to land, I mean, the result was that they maintained state land ownership and indeed enshrined it in the constitution, but also made some important changes. The first one is this shift away from viewing land as a sort of access to land as a share of a community land, but rather tending towards individualization of land from that point. So they began to allow inheritance of land. They limited redistribution ever since they came to power. And as a result, this sort of essentially, quite momentously kind of blocked opportunities for young adults to get land in the future through any kind of state redistribution. And in terms of the agrarian question, I mean, the first part is essentially the same. It's maintaining this homogeneous class of peasants, albeit with a sort of a growing concern around migration and sort of the need to keep people in rural areas as a motivation. But the key change is the second part of the agrarian question, essentially, that rather than the sort of the state surplus extraction model of the Derg era, it was sort of an attempt to model themselves on what they saw as the experience of Korea and Taiwan, whereby you have smallholder producers creating a surplus, which is used to finance industrialization. And then the third part, again, remains very much the same, that the EPRDF styling itself as the vanguard party of the peasantry, whereby land reform creates this homogenous class with common interests, and therefore the EPRDF can lead them in the pursuit of development. Yeah, so then the next sort of major change happens from the sort of early to mid 2000s. I don't have an awful lot of time to go into this, but there were a series of political crises which the leadership of the EPRDF came to term as Armageddons that sort of threatened the survival both of the party, but also ultimately of the country. There was a major split in the TPLF in 2001, urban protests following that, then a major food crisis, then contested elections in 2005. And essentially the result of that was a series of shifts in the development strategy. First of all, within agriculture, that's questioning this idea, first of all, that that you could raise the productivity of all smallholder farmers and that they were all necessarily the focus of attention. but instead switching more towards a focus on high potential small farmers. And then the second one, the selective promotion of agricultural investments, and sort of to some extent going back on this idea of the inverse relationship that underpinned Adley, promoting high value crops in terms of horticultural investments in densely populated areas, and also more extensive agricultural investments in the lowland, more sparsely populated areas. But also a change then beyond agriculture. So rather than this assumption that Adley would lead to create a surplus, an agricultural surplus, which would finance industrialization, but more a sort of separation of those two, whereby you invest heavily in infrastructure and then ultimately placing hopes on FDI in new industrial parks as the mechanism by which they're going to industrialize. And this in turn, these sort of change in focus has then had knock-on effects ultimately in terms of land tenure also. It's interesting in that, this is taking a long time again, I guess this is the pictures in terms of the size of the files, that rather than initial sort of with the federal changes from the federal government, the result has actually been more the result of innovation in terms of regional governments, in terms of them changing their land tenure policies and sort of pushing at the constraints that exist through the federally mandated state ownership of land. So this is from Tigray is one region, the home of the TPLF in the north of Ethiopia. And has proven to be the most reticent to sort of change its land tenure policy. And this is an interview I did back in 2010, which gives you an indication of what they were thinking, where this official basically said the restrictions on rental, sale, and mortgaging of land were there to protect farmers from migration. They didn't think that people should be migrating to other areas. That in Tigray, the land is very steep and the erosion is severe. That's the picture there is a particular sort of extreme example of that. And as a result, the soil is very shallow. And because of this, people want to move away from land. They want to rent or sell their land and go to other places. And that's why they insist on keeping the farmers where they are through the land policy. So it's a quite sort of frank admission that the government officials are well aware of the problems within agriculture and the limitations of agricultural production, but nonetheless, their fear of urban migration and the concerns about social unrest when people move to the cities are such that they feel that they need to keep those restrictions in place and essentially limiting class differentiation, limiting a market and land. Where was I? Yeah, so I mean, Tigray at that point, this is 10 years ago, was probably the most extreme in terms of that view. But you found pretty similar views in most of the other regions as well. So in Oromia and southern nations, you would hear a similar kind of concerns being raised about the prospects of market relations within land and the challenges that would result. What you have is in Amhara a very different perspective, both at that time and subsequently. So this is the top quote is, again, the same time period in 2010 while discussing a land law that they passed in 2006, which basically removed all restrictions on land rental at that time, where they said, the rental gives you an opportunity for labor mobility and for people to take employment opportunities. It's a fear of other regions, but not for them. And that renting is a method of consolidating, having large parcels, and it's indeed their objective to have large parcels because that's going to facilitate technology transfer. So a completely different view from Tigray, where rather than limiting differentiation, limiting migration, they're actually trying to promote it through the consolidation of a land market through rental. Okay. And even at that stage in 2006, the Amhara government actually wanted to go further than that. They were pushing the federal government to try and allow them to the use of landholding rights as collateral, but at that time the federal government restricted them and told them not to do it. And again, I can't really go into the details, but subsequently by 2017, the federal government authority had rather fragmented and fallen apart, and the Amhara government then at that point decided to go alone and launched off and has now issued another land proclamation, which does allow people to borrow against their holding rights. From what their view was that if the constitution doesn't say it's illegal, then it's not illegal and they can do it. So while previously it was essentially assumed that it was banned, and the federal government was quite active in restricting it, this sort of constitutional reinterpretation, they've concluded that there isn't anything explicit in the constitution saying you can't mortgage land, and so they're going ahead and doing it. And subsequently, this has then had a knock-on effect with other regions, including ultimately Tigray, as the somewhat grudgingly, and the federal government have started to move in this direction also, and have also drafted laws which are sort of currently in process. And essentially, the argument is that these changes in land tenure are both significant in themselves, but also reflecting a sort of growing change within the EPRDF's view of the agrarian question and how it's trying to resolve those challenges. So even within the context of state ownership, you see growing individualization, ultimately liberalization of land tenure, with inheritance allowed, end-to-end redistribution, land registration certificates which guarantee rights to particular plots rather than just the share of land, but also now rental and collateral, where there is increasingly a market in land as well. And this represents a new approach to the agrarian question. So there's a clear change in terms of the first part, that class differentiation is now being promoted, so that your more productive users get to accumulate land, your unproductive farmers ultimately exit agriculture altogether. There's a division between capitalist investors on one hand and smallholders, but then also a vital one between smallholders and large numbers of landless, particularly young adults, who have had no access to land through redistribution for some close to 30 years. The second part, again, a quite different view from the past, where industrialization is now seen as a product largely of FDI, and there are still attempts to promote links between agriculture and industry through the creation of value chains and so on, but it's not seen as the key to industrialization in the way that it was in the past. But all of this then has quite important knock-on effects in terms of politics, in that the EPRDF's view of their political base as being the peasantry, in a context when the peasantry is no longer, it's still a very significant slice of the population, but it's no longer sort of the dominant force that it once was. And you also have quite major political challenges around landlessness and unemployment. And it's unclear quite sort of what political groups take on that role within the base of the political base of either the EPRDF or its successor. I think I've made a mess of this next one again with some pictures which seem to be slowing things down. But again, very briefly, because I don't have long, in terms, this sort of politics has important implications. Now, for anyone who's followed Ethiopia at all, the last 5 years has been extremely tumultuous. There was a series of protests in Oromia, particularly from 2015, that ultimately led to the resignation of one prime minister, his replacement by Abiy Ahmed, whose picture is there. Now, these are very complex processes, but a significant part of it is essentially, I would argue, that this failure to address the agrarian question, and ultimately the politics of this agrarian question of labor, that what do you do with large numbers of people that no longer really have a place within the main development model of the country, and mass landlessness on the one hand and mass unemployment on the other. So I will skip on from that large and complex debate and try and wrap up. Essentially, despite state ownership having been continuous for, where are we now, 45 years, there's been quite a significant change within the land tenure system over that period. Individualization and growing influence of markets within land. And these are linked to the EPRDF's attempt to resolve the agrarian question, its growing acceptance of differentiation and FDI as key components within that. And ultimately, this has important political ramifications that, you know, the large sections of the population are no longer kind of clearly catered for by that development strategy, and that's caused major political problems. So I will leave it there.
Great, thanks, Tom. I think we should probably note, we should have done this before, but Harun Akram Lodi who was still listed on the DSA site as presenting had already pulled out his paper. So I hope we haven't disappointed anyone. We had communicated that he wasn't any longer partaking in the panel, but so I apologize for those who might have been expecting that. Tom, should we start and go to bring up Deborah again? And I think, yeah, certainly open it up to the audience and see where we go with certain questions. There's obviously a few different ways to do that. Let me pull Deborah up right now. All right. So I think everyone's up here. I'm just seeing if anyone from earlier, the first session is attending. We could bring you up as well, but I think I don't see anyone. So if you have anyone would like to maybe comment or question, we just start there. Can either, if you certainly welcome to raise your hand, use the raise your hand button, and that way you can just bring you up. Also, in terms of the question function is also a possibility. Well, maybe as we were kind of waiting for Deborah to get back on, and I guess, Tom, just a question for me, not a very maybe complex one, but just in terms of, I know you've done a lot of work in Oromia in terms of pastoralists. I mean, and you know, certainly a lot of dry lands in Ethiopia. How do pastoralists fit into this narrative?
Mm-hmm. A simple answer is that they don't. They've never been, I mean, yeah, pastoralism, as in many places, has been politically marginalized. Pastoralists are seen within sort of smallholder dominated highland Ethiopian circles as being backwards, unsustainable, and problematic, as they are often in many other places as well. So from the government's perspective, yeah, they've been areas to be replaced by large-scale agriculture, essentially, given that they aren't really making the most of the most efficient use of their land. So you bring in, commercial agriculture to replace them. And at the same time, the other sort of major push has been around settlement. So trying to encourage people to settle in one place, often with irrigation investment, some investment in irrigation, so that, you know, essentially trying to bring them in line with the sort of smallholder focus of the rest of the country. With a few exceptions, I mean, that's sort of been the dominant narrative, is that, yeah, they're a problem and therefore need to be addressed in one of those ways, cleared out the way, or turned into settled smallholders.
Yeah, I guess sort of business as usual, right? The ongoing fragmentation of the rangelands and enclosures, and whether it's for agriculture or conversion to agriculture, other purposes, even conservation, protected areas. It's sort of similar type of thing. We're going to spotlight Julian, who's raised his hand. Bear with us a moment. Hi, Julian. I think you are now live.
Yeah, Julian Kwan from NRI University of Greenwich. Just a question for Tom. Thanks. That was a really great overview of the political economy of land in Ethiopia. I'm wondering what the evidence is of mass landlessness. I can see how, in theory, the strategy may be pointing that way, but Amhara and Tigray federal government are promoting mass smallholder registration. They've had a lot of donor support to do that. Despite the emphasis on FDI, I don't think there's evidence that's really displacing large numbers of people. liberalized rental markets should, in theory, allow some kind of readjustment through market mechanisms and facilitate access to land and enable people to rent out surplus holdings. So unless we're talking about actual saturation of the land, limitations in land access, net land availability, I'm not sure where the mass landlessness is coming from. Can you explain that?
Yeah, no, I perhaps wasn't the clearest on that. And I think, yeah, there are three processes, and of those, those two that you mention are emerging and have had important, well, there's probably four processes in which have had varying levels of influence. So yes, there's agriculture investments, which have displaced some substantial number of peoples, but no, in terms of a country of a population of 100+ million, it's not vast numbers. In terms of the rental markets, there is potential there, but this is very early. Yeah, this is very early phases. So yes, it's more of a trend, and where the government now sees the direction going, rather than necessarily that this has had vast impacts on landlessness already. Probably more significant is urbanization, the urban expansion of cities from major cities, well, from Addis to regional capitals and right down, has been enormous, and so you have seen quite major displacement of people through urbanization. But by far the biggest one is essentially is population growth. That you have the last redistribution everywhere, but Amhara was in the late 1980s. In Amhara was in 1997. And since that time, as a young adult, you might be able, you along with your siblings might stand some chance of getting some land inherited from your parents. You have some possibility through rental markets, but the main source of land, access to land that previously existed in terms of state redistribution, just doesn't exist anymore. And so, so the government doesn't produce any statistics on landlessness whatsoever. There is a consensus that it is significant. The studies that do exist that have looked in particular localities usually find figures of sort of 20, 30, sometimes even 40% landlessness. But essentially anyone in most of the country, anyone under, what would it now be, 20? Anyone who would have been under sort of 45, 50 currently would not have accessed land through state redistribution. They would have been under 18 at the last time land was redistributed, and therefore wouldn't be able to access land in that way. Now, obviously, if you look at the population distribution in Ethiopia, that is a vast number. Obviously, some people have accessed land through inheritance in that time and other mechanisms. But there is clearly, I think it's pretty apparent that there's a huge problem, and the challenge is clearly knowing quite how big a problem that is. But it is a substantial one.
Thanks, Tom. We have a question. I'm going to publish this. It's from Rachel Goldsmiths in London. Let's see, I haven't done this before. Okay, everyone should see it. Tom and Deborah, you see this, everyone?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And I think, so as the question says, Tom, can you say more about the politics of land grabbing and protests in Ethiopia, and whether there may be anything to learn from land struggles in Brazil? And I think I'll take the liberty to also say, Deborah, we can avert this and maybe say anything to learn about the politics or things in Ethiopia vis-a-vis Brazil. So maybe after Tom, you're welcome to reflect on that as well. And
sort of the main wave of agriculture investments, which has been called land grabbing, and in many ways took place at a period when the EPRDF was particularly strong and powerful. So around sort of in the food crisis, 2009, 10, 11, that period. And at that time, opportunities for protest were pretty limited. A highly centralized, coercive state basically enforced these deals in a very top-down fashion, and little to no dissent was tolerated. So you have when these protests flared up in 2015 onwards, among the main triggers for it were indeed many of these agricultural investments, so commercial agricultural investments, which had displaced in many cases some numbers of people. Now, again, I mean, I go back to my answer to the previous one. Some people have said, oh, you know, this was purely something driven by agricultural investments. I mean, clearly they were a flashpoint, but I mean, to my mind, I don't buy the argument that they were the sort of one of the main causes of these protests. I suspect it's more of a bigger structural issue in terms of mass landlessness of young adults who haven't had access to land. So it wasn't that necessarily that young adults were losing land, it's that they never had access, and plus we're now seeing that their older members of their community, parents and others, were actually losing their land. So I mean, I suspect it's a slightly more complex issue than protests being driven purely by those investments. But yeah, the result has been that in Oromia, for example, there's essentially a freeze, and the regional government increasingly hesitant to displace anybody in the wake of these protests, whether for infrastructure or agricultural investments or otherwise. And to a considerable degree, much of the investment has now gone elsewhere within the country in search of land, which, depending on your point of view, is a good or a bad thing. What you can learn from Brazil in that respect, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer, but I would be glad if Deborah would enlighten me.
Well, that's quite difficult, but I don't know. Let's try to think together. But I think it's quite interesting because Ethiopia and Brazil kind of struggle with, for example, and with the agriculture investments, the state agriculture investments. For example, in Brazil, we have this large commodity project that it's pretty much leads all the state investment to the agriculture. So, for example, the state invests in soy and commodities around, I don't know, like 300 million reais. That would be less than $1,000 today. And for small agriculture, the state it's investing around 2,000 reais, for example. So it's, I don't know, they invest in commodity like 10 or 15 times more than in small agriculture now. So it's pretty hard to depend on state policies for the peasants and the traditional communities. So what is the social movements in Brazil are trying to do now is how to think to be more to don't depend on the state, pretty much how it was on the Workers' Party time during the 2000s. So for example, we have this Afro descent movement in the north of Brazil. They don't ask at all for any sort of public policy because they think the state it's not a path to struggle, for example. So we have this major indigenous network that is trying to see how we can push different time frame to identify traditional communities, because, for example, the law in Brazil did a frame time to recognize some traditional communities. So we have the state of Bahia that they put a frame time to all the traditional communities have to tell the state they are traditional communities until 2018. So if you just discover that you are in the indigenous community, after that you cannot recognize or title your land as an indigenous community. So what they're trying to do now is kind of push up this this time frame. But I don't know. Now in Brazil, we have the high rates of rural leaderships being assassinated in the world. Like, so it's been a kind of a struggle now with the Bolsonaro government, and also Brazil. It's a major country that is receiving pensional funds on rural lands, on agricultural lands. So we also are struggling in how to think that the land grab also changing the relations of the traditional communities and the fight, because Brazil have also high rates of land concentration, and we have like all this high bureaucracy that how these traditional communities can access to land, and the land is quite different to receive financial capitals to invest in, and the bureaucracy to recognize like a traditional land, it's quite different. So we are trying also to frame how we can push up more land rights to traditional people. I don't know if I answered the question, but
A lot of rich commentary there. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. And we're actually going to, Julian has a question for you. We're just going to bring him back to the stage, as they say. Okay, should be live. And all right, Julian, you're live.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. I had a couple of questions for you. Thanks for your great presentation. The first was really a clarification that if I understood you right, you're saying that the Bolsonaro government is now no longer issuing title at all, not to anyone, but is issuing land concessions. So I presume that is primarily to private land users who have a commercial proposition, and that social movements and indigenous groups can't take advantage of that. And then if it's okay, I'll come back with another question when you've clarified that.
No, what is going on now, it's the private title land, it's running as usual, including with World Bank financial projects. And traditional and peasant lands are sort of shut down now. So title small lands or traditional lands. And for that, the only bureaucracy way that you can access is to conceive like a land concession. So it's like for the commercial agriculture, you can title the land, but for traditional communities, you have this undetermined concession by the state that any moment could just dispossess the people that are in this land. So that is kind of what is going on now. If it's because my English is really rusty, so I'm really sorry for that. I'll try to be as much as English comprehensive in my answers. I'm sorry for that.
About how social movements and other progressive forces are responding to the situation. But what I was really intrigued by is the last thing in your presentation in which you raised land struggles and territorial struggles simultaneously. And I did research on land and territorial development in Brazil for some years during the period of the Lula government. And the impression then was that the kind of strategy on land and development was really diversifying. On the one hand, there was indigenous titling. There was continuation of land reform by both market means and through INCRA. There was an emphasis on titling minifundia, for example, and there was also strong emphasis in certain social movements on territorial development. And what I wondered at the time is, was Brazil moving towards a reframing of traditional land reform or the traditional agrarian problem towards one more of territorial development, whereby you needed a reasonably equitable land distribution that reflected the diversity of interests within different territorial units and was favorable to, if you like, reasonably equitable local economic development. And there were various avenues through which you could do that, including strength. It wasn't all about land reform. It was partly about strengthening smallholder value chains, building rural-urban links, et cetera, et cetera. And it seemed to be quite a productive period, although MST was perhaps not that enthusiastic about it. Now, the impression I get is that all of that has been thrown out. And thinking forward, I mean, we hope that the Bolsonaro government's days are numbered. His response to COVID-19 has been appalling, and that alone ought to be enough to unseat him. But that aside, are social movements, are progressive forces formulating any kind of future strategy, how to move forward with land reform and territorial development? And what would the opportunities be? How do you see it? Thanks.
I don't know. I think it one of the bad legacies that the Workers' Party lead to the rural social movements in Brazil is exactly that. Like, none of the left parties or the major social movements, as in the federal scale, are like thinking or formulating a land revolution or a land reform to Brazil. So I think we have really quite interesting cases and victories in local and regional scales, but not in the federal scale, because one of the things that it's also interesting is how after the 90s, we see that the category as a peasant in Brazil shift to these multiple identities on the rural zones. So if we have this this concept as a peasant, now we have even recognize it on the federal law, like fishermen, indigenous, Afrodescents, gerazeiros, babaçu, and coletores de capim dourado. That it's also like a lot of different identities, and each of these identities are struggling for like their own little piece of land or their own little piece of public policy. So one of the things that we also try to frame now is if it was to the better to recognize all these multiple and different identities and different land uses in Brazil, or if we are also fragmentizing the land rights and the land struggle in Brazil, or even in Latin America. We have also some cases, similar cases as Brazil is struggling now. So I don't know, like with pandemic crisis and Bolsonaro crisis, I don't think we have a lot to predict about the future. But I don't know. I don't know how you see through your Brazilian studies after the conference. We can also keep exchanging some ideas if you want to.
Yeah, we certainly welcome other comments or anything. I mean, we Tom, do you want to add anything? I don't know if you were reflecting on anything at all over the past few minutes. Or...
No, I think I'm good. Unless there's more questions forthcoming.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any sort of synthesizing, all brilliant question to wrap things up. I mean, there's things floating around, but certainly I'll give it maybe another minute or so. And I mean, I think there's certainly, I'm thinking of the earlier panel with on the large scale land acquisitions, that there was some synergies there. I mean, I certainly welcome, even if those who are attending just reflecting generally. I mean, obviously we're discussing broad issues here, so there's it doesn't have to tie in necessarily to the Brazilian case or the Ethiopian case or any of these issues around social differentiation and land development pathways, reform. The stuff on social equity earlier, land policy, resource and resource tenure and governance. I mean, I don't know if there were other very other than the earlier one this morning, other panels I think were somewhat scarce on land related issues, but certainly welcome any reflections and comments. Okay, so let me actually publish this from all, I think this was, yeah, just now. Okay, great. All right, so Deborah, are you seeing this?
How state governments respond to federal policy in the world, opportunity for more decentralized. Yes, I think we have some decentralized policies as in Ethiopia as well. For example, now this program is also shut down by Bolsonaro government, but we had some, for example, policies that it's related to land and small productive zones that it was decentralized, for example, and spaces that were responsible to feed public schools and donate food for poverty communities. We also had some because I have to think a little bit better, because with Bolsonaro, almost all the programs that were related to decentralized land power on land policies were shut down. Like we lost the ministry that was thinking in small scale agriculture. And so now, like current, I cannot remember a policy that is happening or a program that is happening now. All the decentralized policies were in the Workers' Party period. So I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, the issue of decentralization is such a major one. It's very different in Ethiopia. Tom, I get it sort of so as far as a political process. Not sure if you want to reflect on that for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the sort of the oddities of this whole process is that in an extremely centralized political setting, certainly up until the last few years, you had the changes really resulting from regional level innovation. And indeed, some of them were, it's quite questionable whether they did even fit within the constitution. Because I mean, technically, you have the federal government has the constitutional right to issue all laws on land, but then the regional government constraints federal within the constraints of federal law. And yeah, there are certainly at least a couple of points where Amhara would seem to be slightly outside of the federal law and therefore outside of the constitution. Yet, you know, it was sort of more, the reality was, you know, as long as they did things which were roughly in line, which didn't cross the sort of red lines of what the federal government really wanted from land, they seem to have been allowed some latitude to sort of to do their own thing. And they didn't, you know, when for example, with mortgaging in the mid 2000s, when they tried to pursue that, they were rather unceremoniously told that they were pushing too far. But on the other issues, they were allowed to sort of experiment and nudge a bit further. But it's also interesting that the urban land administration is complete opposite. So federal in terms of rural administration, essentially it's the regions which have really led this process. The federal government sort of set up the basic federal constraints and then allowed regions to get on with it. In urban land administration, it's the complete opposite, where the federal government has never allowed any regions to come up with any regional land policies whatsoever. So they're just told to do what to do to fall in line and follow directives. So yeah, I don't know. There are some interesting divergences there, some of which can be explained and some of which are sort of slight oddities.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think if anyone in the audience wants to also reflect on that, whether it's generally or with respect to a certain case, they're welcome to. Or if there are other questions, other than that, we can also just we can end on that note. Maybe we'll let that sort of hang for a second. I mean, Deborah, Tom, anything else you wish to add? Maybe closing comments there.
No, just thank you very much for everybody's time, and
yeah, thank you, everyone.
All right. Well, I think, Tom, then as co-conveners in this, I think we can we'll wrap this up. And yeah, we thank everyone for participating, for attending. We hope there was some valuable perspectives shared across the two sessions today. So thanks very much, and take care.